We have a moment of silence. The bugler will render honors. Thank you. Be seated. Now I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker. Mr. Bill Kamer is a native of Wisconsin, graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in secondary education from the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh. He later earned 2 master's degrees in mass communications and school administration from Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. He joined the United States Army in 1989 and attended basic training right here at Fort Dixon, New Jersey. Upon graduation, he attended advanced individual training to become a chaplain's assistant and was awarded the military MOS 71M at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. In 2007, he was promoted to the rank of Master Sergeant, becoming the Joint Forces Headquarters Senior Chaplain Assistant. In 2013, Master Sergeant Kamer was assigned as Master Religious Affairs NCO at Army National Bureau Headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, that serves the 50 states and the District of Columbia and 3 U.S. territories. He held this senior position for 5 years until he retired after 29 years of service as a chaplain's assistant in 2018. Upon his retirement, he accepted the position of Executive Director of the Fort Chaplains Memorial Foundation, in which he currently serves. Master Sergeant Kamer also serves on the staff of Arlington National Cemetery, in which he schedules and conducts services for our nation's heroes. He has currently conducted over 1,000 services. His awards include Legion Merit of Honor, Army Commendation Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters, Army Achievement Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, Army Reserve Component Achievement Medal with silver oak leaf cluster, Humanitarian Service Medal, Armed Services Reserve Medal with silver hourglass, and NCO Professional Development ribbons. Master Sergeant Kamer currently resides in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Mia, who is an editor of a major news service organization. Ladies and gentlemen, Master Sergeant Kamer.
It says kind of a homecoming for me. Hate to admit you're getting older, but 35 years ago, I was probably 20 miles from here, sitting in the barracks, wondering what the heck I was doing. You know, my dad said I did everything backwards. You know, I went and got my master's, gave back my ROTC scholarship, and then at age 30, I said, you know what? I think I'm going to join the Army. You know, so I came here and joined the Chaplain Corps and served as a chaplain assistant. And I was very fortunate. The audience here is probably old enough to know, so back in 1989, you used to get a little publication in your house. It'd come there, and it was the Reader's Digest. And the cover story of Reader's Digest, when I enlisted in April 1989, was the story of the 4 chaplains. So throughout my whole military career, this story. Plus, I grew up in a family. My dad served in World War II. He followed Patton through the Battle of the Bulge. I had 2 brothers serve in Vietnam, so the story itself had an impact on me, not only because, you know, I was in the Chaplain Corps, but the fact that it related to what my dad did. So since these guys did such a great job telling the story, my speech is probably cut in half. No, I'll do what Paul Harvey used to say, tell you. I'll tell the rest of the story. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why these chapels are so important. So as a chaplain assistant in the U.S. Army, we were responsible for what we call garrison chapels. So we used to always tell the chaplains, you're called to serve, but I'm called to serve you. And one of the things you need to understand is I own this building, sir. When you come in here, don't mess it up. So we allow our chaplains to come in here and preach and counsel, but we really took a lot of pride in taking care of this building. So when I walk in here today, it kind of feels like home, and that's what it should feel like. So you do have a chapel in Philadelphia, the Chapel of 4 Chaplains, and even though I'm responsible for its upkeep, one thing I never want to do is make it too modern. You should be able to come in here, and many of you have served before, has a certain feel, certain smell to it, you feel like you're home, and that's what the chapel should be. So when you come to Philadelphia, there's a plaque on the wall just over here on the altar, and it says, this chapel is more precious to me than physical existence. And that plaque was dedicated by Daniel Poling. So he was the father of Clark Poling. Daniel Poling served as a chaplain in World War I and World War II. And like they said, when he went off the war, he was just going to enlist. He says, I can fight like anybody else, Dad. He grew up in Ohio. Us Midwestern people, you're used to shooting stuff. So he's like, the kid says, I can shoot. And his dad counseled him and said, hey, son, if you want to die for your country, go as a chaplain. You get to go as a non-combatant, and the Army pushes you right up front. So he decided to follow in his father's footsteps and serve. So let me give you a little tour of our chapel, and I'll help you tell the stories. When you walk in the doors today, and the Chapel of 4 Chaplains, this is similar to when it was at Temple University, and now it's at the Navy Yard. The first thing you'd do is you'd pass the Dorchester. And that Dorchester, unfortunately, I tell my Navy people, because Philadelphia is a Navy town, that belonged to the Army. It was an Army ship. So the Dorchester used to be a cruiser to go from Baltimore down to Florida. It was a luxury ship. Well, when the Army got it in 1926 and reconverted to put 902 troops on there, it was no longer a luxury ship. Top speed was probably 12 knots. And in that winter, when they go across the Atlantic, most of the time they're going about 10 knots. And the weather was so bad, temperature never really got above 36 degrees. Water temperature sometimes got down to 34. There was so much ice on that ship. There were times they thought the Dorchester would sink on its way to Greenland because of the ice coating. Once you pass the Dorchester and you walk into the room, the first thing you're going to see are the 4 chaplains on the wall. And you heard their stories. So Chaplain Fox, he's the oldest. There's no reason he needs to go off the war. He already did his time as a Marine in World War I, highly decorated. Comes back, has a successful career as an accountant, but he knows what war looks like, and he tells his wife he's going to leave behind a young son, and he's going to go and rejoin the military at age 42. Even the others were all successful. Rabbi Good, born in New York City, actually went to school about 3 miles where I live in D.C., East High School, right by the Capitol. He's deciding whether he wants to be a doctor or a lawyer. His dad's a rabbi, or he wants to be a doctor or a rabbi. His dad's a rabbi. He goes to Arlington National Cemetery on November 11, 1921. And why was that significant? That was when the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was dedicated. And a young man stood there and watched that ceremony and decided that he needed to serve as a rabbi. And then when he goes to York, Pennsylvania, to tell you how smart he is, he drives to Baltimore on the weekends. He goes to Johns Hopkins Medical School and gets his degree as a doctorate. So he could, again, did not have to go and serve. He was already highly successful. And then you go up to Schenectady, New York, where you have Poling, and he's the reason why we're in Philadelphia, because of his dad. Very beautiful church up there. He's a successful pastor, but he decides to go off to Harvard. And then, of course, you have your New Jersey priest, who's kind of the Energizer bunny of the group, and he had a lot of energy, but part of that energy was coaching and mentoring young men. And when he saw them going off to war, he felt he had to do his part, so he enlisted. So you think about it, the 3 major religions in the United States at that time are Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. When I tell the story, sometimes it sounds like a joke. 2 Protestants, a Catholic, and a Jewish rabbi go off to war, but they did that on purpose. The chief of chaplains who spoke at our banquet on Thursday, the chief at that time had to make a decision, and he wanted to purposely put together this team of chaplains to serve in Greenland. There's about 3,000 troops already in Greenland. Why Greenland? We're about 18 months before the D-Day invasion, and they're building an airfield and weather stations, kind of a lookout post before we go into Europe. But most of these soldiers that are going to end up there are going to end up into the fight. It's kind of a temporary spot, and that ship really represents all the services. So that's one reason why the American Legion is so supportive of this story, not just because of the Fort Chaplain story, but people in the American Legion made up that ship. You had about 600 newly enlisted, and like myself, I didn't join the Army to jump in the water, so you can imagine the chaplains trying to coax these young men to save themselves was kind of a task. You had 150 Department of Defense contractors, electricians, plumbers, engineers. We didn't have the Air Corps as an Air Force, we had the Army Air Corps on board. You had a Navy gun crew, you had the Coast Guard, you had the Merchant Mariners. So it was really a collection of almost all the services that we're serving. And the chaplains really made kind of their heyday during the voyage. You know, my dad would tell me when they came back from Europe how long it would take, but it gave them a chance to kind of decompress from the war. Well, the same thing when you're going, but it's a little different going because there's a lot more nervous energy because you don't know what you're going into. You know, when you're coming home, you know you're going home. You're going that way, you don't know what the dangers are going to be. So these chaplains would work their way around. We call it ministry by presence. Work their way around the ship and talk to these young men. And then the thing that they noticed during this time, and a lot of them would admit this, some never met a Jewish rabbi before in their life. You know, I grew up in Wisconsin in a town called Mequon, and if I look back now, I kind of chuckle because Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary was in that town, and that's the church I went to. And you know, it's very conservative, Wisconsin Lutherans, and you know, according to when I'm growing up, I'm keeping hearing, you know, there's a little difference between us and the Catholics, you know, and it always seemed like, you know, there's this kind of little rivalry going on between the Lutherans and the Catholics, and even as a kid, it kind of stuck in my head. Well, that same thing on this ship. A lot of people would look at the different religions and wonder how they get along, but these guys modeled that. You know, they would work together. The priest would come and help the rabbi when he'd do a service on Friday night, and vice versa. So it was kind of a neat working relationship. They really modeled this idea of selfless service. So when they meet at Harvard, the one thing they have in common, they know their religions are a little bit different. What they have in common, though, is their love for humanity. They feel that they're there to serve these soldiers. And when I served in the Army Chaplain Corps, it was an honor to me because chaplains are called by God to serve. They don't have to be there. If you're an Army chaplain, it's kind of a volunteer activity. In fact, your denomination has to let you go. So at any time in the military, if your denomination wants you back home, they just tell the Army or Air Force or Navy, we're taking our chaplain, and he's returning to his home station. So these guys wanted to be where they wanted to be. And by being called, they had to be prepared for anything, and they were prepared that day. So when you walk through the chapel and you see the four chaplains, and at the back of the chapel is a huge mural, kind of like this picture. It's up on the wall. It's a 20 by 12-foot mural. It depicts the final scene of the four chaplains. And you know what happened that night, but one reason we know it today is when this hit the news back in the United States, there was a group of Jewish businessmen got together, and they went to Daniel Poling, who was actually at this time the pastor of the Baptist Church on Temple University. So, did not know this, that Baptist Church was the largest church in the United States in 1951. So these Jewish businessmen go to Daniel Poling and say, this act of selfless service where they gave up their life jackets to save others, and again, think about this. People die during war all the time, but these guys voluntarily gave up their only chance for survival, and they said, we need to save that legacy. We don't really build a church. We want to build a model to other individuals on how to honor people for acts of selfless service and interfaith cooperation. So they built this chapel in the basement of this huge, if you ever go to down Broad Street, it's still there. There's a huge church, takes up a whole city block. It says Baptist Temple, and if you look on the north side, it'll say Chapel of Four Chaplains. And they built this chapel in the basement. Sits about 200 people. And don't think dungy basement. These are Byzantine archways. It's a beautiful chapel. It's there for about 40 years. Think about the organization. President Truman thinks it's so important. He comes up by train from Washington, D.C. He gives the opening speech. He unveils that mural. And they talk about how religion, when religious leaders can cooperate, how it can unite these communities. So it was really kind of a special, we call it kind of a living monument. We thought that was real important. Another part of the story, and we kind of add an extra candle for those that perished. We added an extra candle for an individual. So there's a new book out there called The Immortals, written by Stephen Collis. He's a professor down in University of Texas. He started writing the story about the 4 chaplains, and as he started writing it, he came across an individual that caught his eye, Charles W. David Jr., and he was a steward mate first class on one of the escort ships. So when they leave New York, when they leave Staten Island, New York, they're in a convoy of about 50 ships. They don't know where they're going. When they get out in the ocean, then they're given their directions. So they end up going to Newfoundland. When they get to Newfoundland, they're put in a small convoy. Got the Dorchester in the middle, 2 supply ships, the Lutz and Biscayne on each side. And they gave them these escorts. Tampa up front, the only Coast Guard cutter that had sonar, and then you had the Comanche and the Escanaba on their flanks. Well, when they get torpedoed, really the rules of war at that time was those escorts are supposed to keep going. Because if you stop in the water, then you just become a target. But the Escanaba and the Comanche do turn back. And when the Comanche turns back, this steward mate, first class, Charles W. David Jr., and at this time our service is still segregated. So if you're a black enlistee in the Coast Guard, the only position you could have was a steward mate, and you worked in the kitchen. In his case, he worked in the quarters for the officers. But this 6-foot, 220-pound Coast Guard member who was highly liked on the ship by all 60 crew members, partly because he's very personal, he was a physical presence, but he also played the harmonica, and his good buddy David Swanson over here played the sax, and they would entertain the troops on the ship. He goes to the captain and says, hey, I want to be part of this rescue. So the rules were, we're not going to stop the ship. We're going to lower the ropes, we're going to drive through, and if you can grab somebody that's still alive, grab them and bring them up. Focus on the lifeboats, and unfortunately only 2 of the 14 lifeboats were deployed successfully, and that's what they did. The Comanche rescued about 93 individuals, most of which he had a hand in. At one point, the XO, Lieutenant Anderson, falls into the water. Charles W. David Jr. jumps in the water and saves him. His good buddy, David Swanson, gets so fatigued he can't get back up the rope, and even though he tried to give him encouragement and said, hey, Swami, come on, hang in there, he goes back down and grabs him and drags him up and gets him on the ship. Unfortunately for Charles W. David Jr., he was sick when he did this. He had a bad cold. When he gets to Greenland, 54 days later, he perishes from pneumonia, never to see his shipmates again. In fact, after the war, he was buried in Greenland in the permafrost. In fact, after the war, the military disinterred him and buried him in Long Island, which was his hometown. Never told his parents till 60 years later, when a historian, like your historian here, did some research and said, hey, we need to let people know that these service members were returned. So it's a rich legacy. It's a rich legacy of service. I think by having the chapel in Philadelphia, and we've been there for 73 years, it's kind of a nice place to help have the story in one place. But this is really where the story is. The American Legion has probably been our biggest supporter from day one. If you belong to the American Legion, they actually have a little book for their chaplains and how to tell this story and how to be a chaplain in the American Legion. So it's always been a great partnership with us and the Legion. So February 3rd, 1943 is kind of a sacred day. Congress actually set it aside as kind of the precursor of the National Prayer Breakfast. Kind of started with the 4 chaplains. Now it's kind of moved to May. It's run by different organizations. After the war, all the chaplains received the Purple Heart Distinguished Service Cross, and in 1961, Congress was trying to give them the Medal of Honor, but they couldn't because the way the rules were written, it wasn't a combat vessel. But the Chief of Chaplains interviewed the 230 survivors, and when they interviewed them, they asked them 4 questions, 2 of which were, where were you on the ship when the ship went down, and did you actually see his act of selfless service? And enough of them did that Eisenhower told Congress, we need to come up with a medal. So they came up with the Medal of Heroism, same level as the Medal of Honor. It's only given out one time in the history of our nation, and it was given out to the families up at Fort Myer in January of 1961. As far as Charles W. David, he received the Marine and Navy Cross. After that, our organization gave him a humanitarian award. In 2017, we rededicated our life-saving award to him. And also in that same year, or 2010, the Coast Guard dedicated a ship to him that's down in Florida. So there is a lot of recognition for him, and it's well deserved. So today I want to thank you for taking the time, not only to tell the story and to celebrate the story, but for being here. And Jacob's sitting over here, young guy. I remember him because the same name as my nephew. You know, it's important that as you return to these stories, you bring these young guys with you. I know kids don't like being pointed out, but I was a high school teacher, so there you go. You're lucky I don't give you a quiz when we're all done. But it's important that you pass that story down to others because it's really a timeless story. And let me tell you just two last quick things. So at Arlington National Cemetery, when I first started there 3 years ago, and I went there on purpose. You know, COVID hit. We had to close the chapel in Philadelphia. I went back to D.C. when I heard that Arlington fell 2,000 services behind because people were getting sick. They rescheduled them. They got sick. And, you know, I said, well, what could I do? So I started working there and helping them. And there was a young lady, or not a young lady, this lady, Mrs. Sablotny. She passed away in a retirement home in Pennsylvania. And they asked me to research whether she could come to Arlington. And back then, they would bury the husband and wife side by side. In this case, her husband was buried up right against the wall where the chapel is in Fort Myers. So a very old section. And when I did the research, her husband served on the Tampa, that Coast Guard cruiser that escorted the 4 chaplains. And he died in 1950 while in service. So he has been buried there for over 70 years. We brought Mrs. Sablotny to Arlington, and I was able to do the service in which we laid her to rest right next to her husband. And then this past year, I was dealing with the Fox family, and I noticed that at Arlington, there's only one chaplain that has a memorial headstone. So if you have, and it is big with the Navy, when people perish on active duty and the body is not recovered, at Arlington National Cemetery, you're allowed to have a memorial headstone put in place. And only one of the 4 chaplains has one. That's Rabbi Good. I don't know why the other ones didn't. Maybe didn't know about it. So we started working with the Fox family. So in May, sometime, we'll let your chaplain know. There should be a full honor service there at Arlington National Cemetery, and they'll place that headstone. And we're still working with the Poling and the Washington families to do both of those. So it's important. Last thing. So yesterday, I sent my chairman to Arlington National Cemetery to lay a wreath. And he's laying, right before he lays the wreath, there's a lady in front of him. She's in her 70s, and she's laying a wreath. And they get talking, and her son died in Afghanistan. And her son died on February 3rd, 1943. And his whole unit was there, all these young guys that served with him. And it reminded us that, and my chairman, what we do is important. Telling the story is important. Our mission is to pass the story on and encourage others to do acts of selfless service, and also encourage people from different faiths to work together. So today, when we give an award out today, the gentleman receiving the award is going to be part of this long history. Since 1951, we've been giving out Legion of Honor awards across the nation, and this one's going to be well-deserved, and it'll be my honor to help present that today. So God bless, and thank you for having me today. Hi, sir. Thanks. Stay up there? Yep.